Well, I think, whether it's a BB gun or even a squirt gun or anything like that, one of the biggest things is to have children acclimated to having weapons and guns around the home, to respect them, to know that they are dangerous weapons, and very useful in the right hands, very dangerous if in the wrong hands. But that's why everyone who are good liberty-minded people should have one, because the Bible says that evil is in the heart of men. So we know there's the sayings and the bumper stickers, guns don't kill people, people kill people, and so on and so forth. So you can kill someone just as easily by hitting them over the head with a glass bottle or a stick or a broom handle or a frying pan or something like that as you can, with a gun. If you want to kill someone, you're going to do it. And so having the latest technology, as Pastor Rob was mentioning here just a moment ago, in the times of ancient Israel, they actually went to great lengths, the Philistines did, to prevent Israel from having any swords or weapons. And we're told that they weren't allowed to have any smelters, any iron workers, or anything like that. Israel was not allowed to have even the means to procure or to assemble or make any type of swords or weaponry. Because they knew that if the population had, the means to defend themselves and to rise up and to claim liberty, that they would do that. And so the Philistines went to great measure to prohibit Israel from being able to do that. So anyway, bring your gun to church day. We try to do this each year. I don't recall if we did it last year, but we've been doing it for a number of years now. And I thought it was interesting because when I went through a little bit of research for this, I found that, and I remembered seeing this before, but I'd forgotten. But actually the colonial laws required all white male citizens 16 years and older to actually bring a gun to church in the case of any Negro insurrections or uprisings. Because during that time, which a lot of people fail to take into consideration, that the insurrections, or what they call slave revolts and uprisings of Negroes, especially in the Caribbean and so forth, down in some of the deep southern states and so forth, was having a very devastating, frightening effect on the colonists. And they knew that they needed to be armed and protected. We recall many stories of Negroes going into churches and beheading all the men and women and children there, or killing neighbors, or killing, not just, the plantation owner or the overseer, which was usually black themselves, but just, general mayhem. And so the colonists had laws passed that if you were a white male 16 years and older, you actually had to bring a gun to church, because going to church was seen as a place of reverence. It was a place of peace, a place where you could go to study and fellowship and contemplate things of a godly nature. And so oftentimes people might not quite be on the uptake for being suspectful of some Negro rushing through the back doors of the church or something like that, and their guard was down. And so they were like, hey, we need to, not just say, hey, it's a good idea to bring a gun to church, but you are required to bring a gun to church, because there's nothing to help give you the peace of mind so that you can sit and contemplate things of a godly nature, like knowing that you've got a good sidearm on you so that you can protect yourself or your loved ones in the case of something going awry during a service. So I thought that was quite interesting. Now, this past Friday, I believe it was, maybe Thursday, there was actually and I haven't really looked into all the details of it. I know that it was a shooting at a newspaper office. I think in Virginia, maybe somewhere around the D.C. area. I'm not quite for sure. I don't remember how many were killed. I think 4 or 5, several injured. So really, I haven't looked into the details other than just I heard the news flash on the radio. And of course, after that, there's again the regular debates that go on about gun control, and we need to take guns out of the hands of dangerous people, and we need to have some sort of regulation. People don't need to have assault rifles. People don't need to have these certain types of weapons. We have police to take care of us. We have people that taxpayers pay to take care of us and to watch for us, kind of, I guess, full-time nannies or something like that, and that there's no need to have these type of weapons or guns. And even during the last school shooting, which I think was probably about 3 weeks ago, there were the same different liberal ministers, and unfortunately, some conservative ministers are beginning to get on the bandwagon also by saying that, well, we're not against the Second Amendment. We understand that people need to have this right to keep and bear arms, but nevertheless, the government does have the right, and we should stop and consider regulating these rights. So you have the right, but we're going to regulate the right. It'd be kind of like saying you can't murder, but we're going to regulate murder a little bit. So in some cases, murder is acceptable, which actually is what they've done. That's why they have abortion and euthanasia as growing popular movements now. So when people start trying to make concessions with the enemy doesn't make concessions towards us. They're not knocking on our door and saying, well, we think you might have some good points. Let's stop and have coffee and discuss it, and maybe we'll kind of see things in your point of view a little bit. They don't make concessions because for some reason they seem to be more bold, because they have an agenda and they know what their agenda is. They know that their agenda is the undermining, the destruction of white Western Christian civilization. On our side, or conservatives in general, it doesn't seem like they quite know that they're in a battle. They don't quite know they're in a war. They just think of it in some sort of spiritual, heavenly, outer space context, into some spiritual warfare and battle, and they don't stop and take into consideration, like Pastor Rob said last week, that this is a real flesh, life, and blood war that we are in, and you can't make concessions with your enemy. You can't say, well, we have the right to self-defense, we have the right to resist tyranny, but we're going to maybe allow you to regulate it a little bit, because we know what happens once you allow the enemy to get a foothold in your front door. They're not going to stop at the front door, at the front porch. They're going to continue to march right in, and they're going to continue to take a little bit by little bit your rights away from you. So, all right, I've got just a few little notes and interesting quotes here that some of you I know are already very well grounded in this, but some of those watching may not be. Okay, first off, the courts have ruled, and this is interesting because I mentioned before that so many on the left say, well, this is why we have police. We have police to protect us, to protect our homes and our neighborhoods and our workplaces, so there's really no need for an armed population. However, the Supreme Court has ruled that there's no constitutional right to be protected by the state against being murdered. So that is an actual finding of the court. They have found that no, because some people have actually gone and they have taken different police districts or state bodies into court and have said, hey, my wife or my husband or my son or daughter, some loved one was murdered. The police time wasn't fast enough. You didn't get there on time. All these different things came together into a volatile situation which caused the death or murder of my loved one. And the Supreme Court itself has ruled that no citizen of this country has the right, the constitutional right, to be protected from being murdered. And that's a very interesting thing, because if we are not able to hold law enforcement liable for our death or some sort of violence perpetrated upon us, if we're not able to hold them liable, then exactly who should be liable? And I believe that we are each liable to take care of our own person and our own body and our own home and community. And so if we give up that right and expect that law enforcement is going to be doing that, we have no constitutional right to expect that from them. And the courts have ruled it that way. And so that is just one more reason to understand why we have to really hold on to this right, this unalienable right, not just a constitutional right to keep and bear arms, but a right that the Constitution and Bill of Rights merely saw that was unalienable, and that, in other words, they just put it down in writing that, yes, we all understand, it's common knowledge, we have the right to self-defense, you can keep and bear arms. And so it wasn't really anything to be questioned at the time, other than the question of those who, at certain instances, had designs upon the colonists, and that would be Great Britain at the time under King George. Now here's a few other interesting quotes. Thomas Jefferson, he said, "The strongest reason for the people to retain the right to keep and bear arms is, as a last resort, to protect themselves against tyranny in government." I think we all can see that is very common sense. James Madison, who most considered to be the architect of the Constitution, said Americans have the right and advantage of being armed, unlike the citizens of other countries whose governments are afraid to trust the people with arms. The Georgia Supreme Court in 1846, they ruled the right of the whole people, old and young, men, women, and boys, and not militia only, to keep and bear arms of every description, and not such merely as are used by the militia, shall not be infringed, curtailed, or broken in upon in the smallest degree. So here they saw that just by any type of regulation, just by the mere fact of saying, well, maybe you should just reduce your magazine capacity because nobody needs to have this many rounds in a gun. I mean, the deer's already gone by the time you've popped off a couple rounds, so why do you need any more than that? Well, they know why we need more than that. The left knows why we need more than that. That's why during one of the previous elections for Obama, Harry Belafonte, the black entertainer and superhero of the 60s, I guess, said that in response to all of those who were opposed to Obama, that he thought they should all be rounded up into camps. So they know what their agenda is, and they know that if they can just, by little increment after increment, just chip away at certain parts of our Second Amendment, that eventually they'll get the whole thing. Kind of like, the old saying about how do you eat an elephant, one bite at a time or something like that. Anyway, so that's what their plan is, and they know that their plan is the total eradication of our weapons, and they know it's the eradication of our weapons because they know that the civilization itself is what is under attack. Next week, I want to show a few slides and pictures of the Bolshevik Revolution. What happened there when the Jewish taskmasters took over that country and took over Eastern Europe, and we had the Ukrainian Holocaust in 22 something. Some have suggested as high as 30 million people systematically rounded up and starved to death, shot, murdered, killed, just totally devastated. Many of the Holocaust photos that are in textbooks today are actually photos of Ukrainians that were killed by the Bolsheviks during the revolution there. Ask those people whether or not it was important to have guns or pitchforks or anything sharp or a sword with the laser on it like Tom Bowie had, something to defend yourself, because you just can't rise up and resist tyranny with glass milk jugs, So you need, as technology advances, we need to take measures to keep up with technology and protect ourselves. Now, the Founding Fathers understood that it was their Christian duty to secure our liberty. Now, during the French and Indian War, the colonies had actually asked for assistance from Great Britain. They'd asked for some military assistance, even though the colonies at that time did have their own militia. They did ask for some military assistance because the Indian raids were just happening to a great extent. Many massacres. People were trying to homestead. They were trying to set up their farms and so forth. And whole small little neighborhoods and homes and stuff would just be obliterated overnight with some of these Indian raids. And the French weren't helping any in that regard. They had seen that the Indians were very useful as bloodthirsty mercenaries, and so they were using them to a great degree. But after the end of the French and Indian War, what had happened is that Great Britain actually decided, well, hey, we've got this little foothold in now. So they decided to keep 10,000 troops in the colonies. And these 10,000 troops weren't in their own garrisons. They were placed into the homes of the colonists. Now, you can imagine how we would feel today, because I've heard some people say, well, that really shouldn't be that big of a deal. They were Christian people in England too, and Christian people in the colonies, and, basically we're all blood cousins and so forth. So there really shouldn't have been, any reason for the colonists to have any fear or anxiety about that. But we could question the same thing today if the UN, with troops from Belgium or Germany or anywhere in Europe, all of a sudden, which I consider to be my blood relatives, but if the UN decided, hey, we're sending 50,000 or 100,000 troops into your communities and they're going to be living in your home. Well, that's kind of a little different story there. I don't want some other military jurisdiction sending their troops and their guards and their trained soldiers in to live with me and my family, because my next question would be, well, come on, what exactly is the purpose of this? Is it because you don't have your own forts? Well, we know that's not true. What is the exact purpose of wanting to quarter these soldiers in our homes? And so that's really one of the primary reasons that the colonists really started to question their relationship to Great Britain, which ultimately led to the War for Independence, was because they were quartering these soldiers in their homes. Now, I've heard different ones sometimes say, well, the Founding Fathers were nothing but rich, fat cat, what's the word? Racist, yeah. Racist. Anyway, just basically a capitalist. Thank you, Bob. I think that's you who said it. Fat cat, yes, and capitalists who are upset because there was an encroachment on their livelihood in the form of these, very small little stamp taxes and tea taxes and so forth. Well, our Founding Fathers, for the most part, gave up everything they had. They lost all of their fortune, their money, and their property, their livelihood. So for someone who was only concerned about saving their own skin and their own pocketbook, and they got upset because of some stinking little stupid minuscule tax, well, these men would not give up everything they had for some little, 3-cent tax. No, it was more than that, is because the tax was only being used as a guise by which the king said, this is why we need to have troops in your homes, because we know you're going to resist this tax, and we need this tax because we need to send it back to England to help pay for some of the assistance that we gave you in the French and Indian War. And the Founding Fathers and colonists, they're like, hey, look, you're saying this is about a little tax, but you don't need 10,000 troops just to make us pay a tax on tea. You've got ulterior motives, and indeed there were ulterior motives. it wasn't just about a little tea tax or a little stamp tax. It was in a grave part in response to the attempt by the colonial governments over and over and over again to stop the Negro slave trade into America, because as I told you previously, they had seen numerous slave rebellions in the Caribbean, many occurring throughout the Deep South and so forth, and they wanted the slave trade stopped. They were like, hey, we've had enough. We inherited these Negro slaves, but we don't want any more. And Great Britain refused to discontinue the slave trade. And so that was one of the main reasons that the colonists were upset about it. And they knew that part of the quartering of troops was to back up the resistance to this lack of adjusting to the colonists' desire to stop the slave trade. Now, for example, in South Carolina in 1715, there were 10,500 blacks compared to 6,250 whites. Georgia banned slavery outright in 1735. An act for rendering the colony of Georgia more defensible, this was the name of their act in Georgia, an act for rendering the colony of Georgia more defensible by prohibiting the importation and use of black slaves or Negroes in the same. That's a really long title, but here's what it says. It says, whereas experience hath shown that the manner of settling colonies and plantations with black slaves or Negroes hath obstructed the increase of English and Christian inhabitants therein, who alone can, in case of a war, be relied on for the defense and security of the same, and hath exposed the colonies so settled to the insurrections, tumults, and rebellions of such slaves and Negroes, and the case of a rupture with any foreign state who should encourage and support such rebellions might occasion ruin and loss of such colonies. So basically, in our modern lingo, they would just say, hey, look, you're making it very difficult for us to protect our property and our homes and our loved ones. You won't stop sending these black savages into our states. Stop it now, because it's going to cause serious problems for our communities. And Great Britain just absolutely right out flatly denied to do that. The Virginia Assembly, they met in 1772, sent a message to the king. In Virginia, blacks outnumbered whites 2-1. And in their assembly in 1772 said, the people of this colony must fall upon means not only of preventing their increase, but also of lessening their number, and in the interest of the country would manifestly require the total expulsion of them. Let me try to skip down a little bit. Some of our Majesty's subjects in Great Britain may reap great wealth from this sort of traffic. And exactly who, what, we know who in Great Britain was reaping great wealth. It was the Jewish bankers, of course, no different than today. Reaping great wealth. But when we consider that it greatly retards the settlement of the colonies with more useful inhabitants, they mentioned destructive influence, that when placed in competition with the security and happiness of such numbers of our Majesty's dutiful and loyal subjects, they're asking your Majesty's governors of this colony, which inhibit their assenting to such laws as might check so pernicious a commerce. So again, there's Virginia asking, please stop sending them into the colonies. We want good, useful English settlements. Good, useful English settlements. Settlers and God-fearing men, women, and children. They don't want the savages from Africa coming into their country any farther. Now, the Continental Congress, they formed the Continental Army just a little while after that, and they said, citizens far and wide were in possession of guns. Let's see. They say that they do not believe that any legitimate army would go without guns, that they must have them, and that they need them to protect against Negro insurrection. So again, we see time, and I've got pages and pages of this that I don't think anyone wants to sit and hear me read every bit of it. But the main point is that as one of our papers of the Crusader that was published here recently said, America founded upon a white identity. That was one of the main reasons for the War for Independence. It's one of the main reasons for the Bill of Rights, the recognition of the right to self-defense, to keep and bear arms, was because they knew and understood that they had a race problem in America. The race problem didn't just start 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. It didn't just start in some of the early riots in the South or in Detroit. It didn't just start in the 60s. They had a race problem all the way back since the inception of this country, when some thought that they could reap wealth by bringing in black slaves into the colonies. And we can see what this has, the consequences upon us today. We have a horrible race problem. It's out of proportion with anything that we've seen in the past. So they thought they had problems with blacks then. We really have problems with them now. We're being inundated with non-whites from other foreign countries, all who band together with blacks. So it's not just a black problem, it's a problem of non-white heathen people who want to obliterate and destroy white Christian culture, because somehow they think that, I guess they think they can do it better, or they're not very foresighted. They can't really see, the forest through the trees. They can't really see the consequences of what this will mean to them. I mean, I don't know who they think is going to send their care packages to them and send the military with the little food pouches and drop off at their doors and in their villages, and who's going to dig their well and look for clean water, who's going to send them smallpox vaccines, if you're into that. But anyway, who are going to do these things? So these people are very short-sighted, but it's in their nature, and they are being very useful agents of our time-long enemy, the Pharisees, the Judaizers, those who have a desire, an earnest desire to see the destruction of Jesus Christ and his kingdom and our people. And so we see all the way back during the times of the colonies, even during the days of Napoleon and in the Caribbean, there was peace movements rising up to free the black slaves. And smart guys at the time were saying, yeah, slavery's not been a good idea. It really hasn't helped our people any. It's helped a few out, but what are we going to do with them? So this question of what to do with them, of course, we know Lincoln and several others worked together to send them back to Africa. And of course, we see how well that worked out with Liberia. They're such a thriving nation now under their own self-government. But nevertheless, the American Revolution and the means to secure that revolution or independence through the right to keep and bear arms was not just about a little tiny stamp tax. It was about a race war, and it was about the destruction and preservation of white Christian civilization. And I'm going to end, I don't know what time it is because that clock seems to have been standing still for quite a while in the back there. But let me read two more quotes. This is by historian Mary Theobald. She says, "The fear of slave insurrection was genuine in all English colonies, especially in the South, where slave numbers were greatest. In the 1760s, there were risings in Loudoun, Fairfax, Frederick, Stafford, and Hanover counties, most of which involved the deaths of whites. Through the early 1770s were relatively quiet. Every white colonist knew that violence would erupt without warning. George Mason, who had been a signer of the Declaration, he said, by prompting our Negroes to rise in arms against us, these very Negroes whom by an inhuman use of his negative he hath refused us permission to exile from the nation by law, in reference to King George. And on December 10th, 1770, King George III issued instructions commanding the royal governor of Virginia under, quote, pain of the highest displeasure to assent to no law by which the importation of slaves should be in any respect prohibited or obstructed. And of course, next week I'll talk a little bit about the attempts of many different slave insurrections on the magazine where they kept the ammunition and powder and so forth, and also several plots by British military to actually arm and aid slave insurrections, all to help dismantle the growing conscience of liberty in the colonies. So I will close with that. We all have a word of prayer.